Kiran Karnik occupies an unusual position in public life because he has worked on both the practical and the policy aspects of technology for close to 4 decades. In his practical avatar, he was actually one of the early members of India's space program. He worked at ISRO for 20 years. He has worked on atomic energy. He's worked on the INSAT satellite project. He has worked in communications technology, especially information communications, when he helped launch discovery networks in India. And then he went on, in his avatar as a policymaker, he went on to head Nasscom for 6 very crucial years, the years in which it really went on to take a public role globally and within the country of great influence. But he has also, in other ways, been involved in aspects of Indian public life outside of technology. He was on the RBI board, not the most popular place to be in recent times, but for 5 years he was on the RBI board. He was also on pretty much every single influential acronym in the world. He has worked in stints at the UN, UNESCO, World Bank. And I think all that combination of experiences has helped shape his vision, not just of technology, but where it can occupy a space in our public life. Today, there is absolutely nothing that technology does not shape. It is not outside of us, it is embedded in us. Usually, by the time you've had breakfast, you've already engaged with technology in a dozen ways, just with this single device. So where is this story headed? Not just for us as a country, but as a species. There is absolutely no better person to start this conversation with than Kiran Karnik. May I have him up on stage? May I start with a question not linked to technology? You call yourself a public non-intellectual. Is that because intellectual is the 4-letter word in the room now?
Yeah, you know, you're in deep danger if you call yourself an intellectual, anything bordering on that. No, but that's not the reason. You know, intellectual to me is somebody who's an academic, who's gone into great depth in a certain field and has an understanding which makes them a guru in that field. I'm nowhere near that. I'm the sort of person who's been here and there, as you mentioned in the brief introduction, and seen many different things.
A lot of here's and a lot of there's.
Well, that just tells you that's why I'm so grey, but yes, a lot of different things.
So to start the conversation about technology, and broadly I want to peg it into 2 separate aspects. The practical aspects that in fact we all engage with every day, and then the conceptual aspects, I think, of where technology is said to take the species as a whole. So if we start with the practical, and I think you deal with it extensively, with both aspects extensively in your book, Evolution, which says, which is decoding India's tech story, but it's actually also decoding the tech story as a whole. There are every single aspect, healthcare, education, finance, evolution itself, procreation, have all been shaped by technology. What is your relationship with technology? Are you an optimist? Are you a cautionary? Or are you a pessimist?
Well, I'm an optimist, frankly, and I think that's the stance which you need to take unless you lose all hope, because technology, as you rightly mentioned earlier, dominates everything we do today. And if you're not an optimist about technology and what you might do with it and what it can do, then you're going to go into deep depression, because it's all around you, it dominates you, it dominates everything you do, and you interact with it practically every single moment of the day. So yes, I am an optimist, but that's very different from being either a technology evangelist or a marketeer of technology. I think that one has to be careful about.
Why should, okay, before I come to what I was going to ask, why does one need to be careful about being an evangelist of technology?
Well, you know, I don't think technology can solve all our problems. There are many people who, you know, tout technology as a solution, a magic bullet to everything and anything that can happen. And I don't think that is so. There's some wonderful things it can do, and yet there are things about which we need to worry. And let me just give you one very brief example. I think Aadhaar, despite my hesitation on other counts, is a great thing. And let's give part the privacy part of it, and that's a separate issue altogether. But it's something fantastic. It empowers those who had no identity and gets them to do all kinds of things. But there are practical problems, and if you use this as a technology solution to solve your problems about, you know, PDS grains disappearing, or saying that there are so many people who are on the roster who don't exist, both very true, but the problem needs a deeper analysis, and not the solution is not necessarily technological, it's often systemic. And the process of a technological solution, you tend to leave out that small number, that small percentage, which in this country is a huge number. And irrespective of that, I think it's every last man we should take care of. And that can't happen if you depend only on technology as a solution for everything.
So for example, I think you've spoken of this in the book also, when you look at, say, new manufacturing technologies like 3D printing, right? On the one hand, they are tremendously liberating, but on the other hand, they're also responsible for one of the biggest crises that we already face, that in fact the economy faces, which is job losses and job creation. It seems like that is an aspect of technology that can only accelerate one problem while solving another. Is that fated to be the nature of our relationship with technology, that it will create as many problems as it solves?
Well, you know, on the first part of what you said, I must disagree with you. When I said I was a technology optimist, it's partly for this reason, that it's true that new technologies often displace a lot of people from existing jobs. But if you look back over history, you'll see that every new technology that has come in has in fact created many new jobs in different areas, different fields. And there is always this problem of who loses and who gains, or how do you make sure that the transition is smooth and easy. But the fact is that while technology will lead to job loss in existing professions, in the medium to long run, you're going to have more possibilities of jobs of different kinds. And let me not rule out non-technological jobs. You know, if technology frees you to do something, maybe there'll be a lot of jobs in writing poetry or creating art, for which there'll be demand.
It's very heartening to hear you say that, but I'd like to know, in your estimation, where will that job creation be? And you did mention, I think we'd all love to write poetry, but very few of us can or should be able to make money out of it, going by the average poetry one reads. Where do you think there will be jobs created by technology that have also economic creation in them?
Yeah, well, you're right. I think poetry and art are a distant kind of thing, ideal maybe, but different. No, if you look at what happens, I mean, go back in history and look at how things were transported, yet transported in this country, but 100 years ago, and that's transitioned. And, you know, the person who drove the bullock cart may lose his or her job, but the automobile industry has come up and it's a huge employer. There are trains that are manufactured, run, creating jobs of all kinds, not only in manufacturing, but down the line to use them. So the net result is that the new technology absorbs new kinds of jobs. The problem is not that. The problem is that the person who drove the bullock cart doesn't have the skill to go and do something else. And the question, therefore, is one of how do you bring in the new skills, the new understanding, the new technologies to people in existing jobs, and can you? And that, I think, is a big question. And therefore, in the short run, you will see disruption, you will see problems, you will see difficulties. But, you know, I think if you look ahead at technology in general and take a perspective which may be good or bad, is beyond just the short term, you will see things in terms of job creation. So to your specific question, I think you will begin to see new kinds of jobs in new areas which we can't even imagine. I mean, today, industry, I'm very familiar with the IT industry, directly employs over 3 million people, and indirectly probably 10 million people. And 25 years ago, you wouldn't have even dreamt of it. And I'm talking not of manufacturing, not of making computers, but just of using them. And 25 years ago, you would have said impossible, which is why, and some of the older people in this audience would remember, that when it was proposed to introduce computers into banks, the unions were up in arms because they felt they'd lose their jobs. And they were not wrong about their particular job, but in terms of job creation, you see what it's done.
So which are the tech developments in our present moment that make you optimistic about the future? And I don't mean just in terms of jobs, but in terms of the human future. What are the areas of tech work? And often what we see are the fruits of tech, which comes much later. So I'd say from your vantage position as an observer of what is the industry focusing on, where can we begin to see breakthroughs that will improve human existence even more than tech already has enabled?
Well, if you look around the world, but certainly in India, I think you will see huge prospects in terms of improving the human condition, but also creating jobs in sectors like education and health, to just take two examples. The kind of education you can do today with using technology, the new healthcare, the devices, the ability to analyze the ability to use artificial intelligence to get to the right diagnosis is just amazing. And these are going to also be creating new jobs in these areas as you go forward. So I think both in terms of what it does for human condition and the ability to reach out and bring costs down to reach those who need them, plus the ability to create jobs, you see both that going to happen in this field. Now, how fast will it happen? Is it going to happen already? Is it happening today? Yes, to some extent. Not to the extent we need, but yes, there is.
So to also take off from there, you've said in the book and elsewhere, I know, that technology also has the power to create a new kind of caste system. And I mean, I'd like to explore what you mean by that. But has that not historically always happened with technology? Has it always not been the privilege of a few? What is so worrying about the chasm that technology can create between the haves and have-nots today?
You know, I'd come back to the question which I've addressed in the book about creating a new caste system. But first, in terms of empowerment, look at what the little device you're holding has done. It has truly empowered those who had no ability to do what they do today. And I think, therefore, to feel that technology is a tool of the elite, of those who know, of those who can afford, is no longer true. And that's what the new technology is changing. Yes, there was a time when maybe technology was a tool of the oppressor, as many of us used to feel. I did when I was younger. Now I've gone either senile or maybe wiser. But I think technology can and does actually empower people, especially the new technologies. Your question on the caste system, and this, I don't know if you want to get into that now, but I want to talk about what I foresee might happen. And this is part of the concerns that technology raises. Look at what's happening in the area of healthcare and the ability today to create what are called designer babies. You can do genetic engineering, you can do genetic editing today, and gene editing is already a question of some controversy, but you can create the kind of babies you want. Now, marry that with something else that's happening, the ability to put in brain implants. And we read about new developments in this every time, almost every day. Just a few days back, there was this thing about picking up brain signals for speech. So not just your standard speech to text, but now your thought to text. And I think a great thing for those who have problems, Stephen Hawking being one example who did something else to solve that problem. But look at what it can do. If you can put all the information that you need on a small chip and then implant that in your brain, you have all the knowledge that's there and can be updated constantly, like you update stuff on your computer. And you'll be a superior human being in terms of brain power. Now, in the first stage, typically in the world we live in with market forces, who's going to use this? Those who can afford to. It's going to be expensive. So you get the rich getting smarter.
You said this very nicely in the book. You said it won't be smart people getting richer, it will be rich people getting smarter.
Absolutely,
Well, I would argue that we could afford that. We may have enough rich, I'm not sure we have enough smart. But
I know. No, especially in this day, when we're talking of startups and the excitement is about, hey, you just need an idea and you'll make your money.
But what you're saying is that in the short term, access to those very, very elite technologies will in itself become exclusionary, and for a while that chasm may grow wider. Right?
Absolutely. That's just the worry, that not only brain power, your physical power may go up, and you may or may not need that, but with things like robotic arms, you can do a lot more. And while some of it is used for good again, for doing some things which are necessary, you might have superhuman beings, super beings both physically and mentally. And since affordability will be a question, this will be, as you quoted rightly from the book, the rich getting smarter and the rich getting more powerful. And therefore, you have a whole new caste system, because now the rich will be able to do this, and they will be able to do this right from the stage when they're having their next baby. And as I've also said in the book, that you might reach the stage where you, in effect, get a PhD with your birth. Because as you're born, you put something in the brain, and hey, all of us who spent 2 decades studying don't have to do any of that. So
you've interestingly dealt with the impacts of technology on aspects of our life that are almost invisible now, that we take for granted. Money, for one. The shape of money has changed. And when I say the shape, it no longer even has a shape. These days, you can earn money and spend money without ever seeing it, right? And even that's not new. We're now looking at, obviously, cryptocurrencies that don't even exist in a tangible form. Do you see this, again, as being more enabling than dangerous? Or is there a cautionary tale when you make money invisible? Because that is also linked to the spread of a lot of global terrorism, drugs, crime, the entire dark net. So again, what is that particular balance in which we can harness the positives and not, can avoid the negatives?
You know, in my thinking, this is really not the problem of technology. The problem is, in some ways, the UNESCO Charter famously says, wars begin in the minds of men. And so it's in the minds of men or women that you've got to create the users of this
No,
technology.
we'll stick to men.
As long as you talk about the bad stuff, yes. No, I mean, look at cryptocurrency. You give a very good example. I think it creates a lot of possibilities, the fact of digital money, which can be easily moved around. And already things are happening in India where it's empowering the very small, not just a small business, but the street vendor, for example. As long as the transaction moves to the digital framework, which it began happening in the terrible days of demonetization, or I shouldn't say terrible probably, in the days of demonetization, the street vendor was selling tea, got his payments on one of the apps, Paytm, for example. And that gives him a whole record of what payments were made, what transactions were made. And therefore, his or her creditworthiness now is based on actual data, and you don't need collateral. And so giving loans to such people who have no collateral, who have nothing they can put against a loan, becomes so much easier. And therefore, it's empowering them. And this is not theory, it's begun to happen already. On the other hand, yes, these digital currencies are anonymous and therefore can be used for drugs, for terrorism, for whatever. And so again, the same thing, that it's really what the human mind does in terms of the use. The technology can be used for good or bad, the kind cruelty of the surgeon's knife.
So, and we'll come back to the ethical questions, but the other interesting intervention, and you asked this question in your book, I'm interested in the answer. You said, can weapons of mass communication become essentially more powerful than weapons of destruction, of mass destruction? What is your belief, and what is the nature of that power?
I genuinely believe in this because, the big thing today is not about, sending a nuke out, whether on Diwali or any other day, and killing a lot of people, but it's about influencing people's minds. And therefore, the so-called soft power, which has been spoken and widely written about, is about how you influence those whom you want to influence, be it your enemy or somebody else. This is obviously a takeoff from what happens fairly routinely in the commercial world, where this is what all clever marketing guys do. They influence you to buy something or not buy something and tilt your mind. And I think you're going to see a lot of that beginning to happen. The worry is, and this I move again to technology, that the kind of data that's available now about you as an individual and people as a whole enables you to begin modeling behavior. And so you can, based on these models, you can predict what a person is likely to do given a certain set of circumstances. And the next step beyond that is that knowing the set of circumstances and therefore what the person will do, you can reverse it and say, if I give this input, this person will behave in this way. So you can begin to influence behavior by certain stimuli or inputs, which is done now routinely. The shops do it. They put certain goods on display in a certain way, knowing that certain kinds of people will look first at this side or that side and pick this.
So it's not directly linked, but I did want to come to something that you also mentioned, which is there's a lot of nostalgia for any one of us who grew up in the same era about how technology has always shaped human behavior. And I think we say a lot more of it now, but in fact, we don't recognize that this too is a constant truth. You give a very interesting example about how technology shapes culture and how that was different in the US and in India, about people picking up the phone and saying hello much more in India. And I'd like you to kind of talk us through that example, because you said it was at a time when we were certain that connections here were poor and connections in the US were much stronger. What was that distinction in how it shaped human behavior and how it shaped our communication?
Well, it's a very simplistic and trite example, but I actually grew up seeing this transition, and so it struck me as being something very special, because when I first went to the US, I was quite amazed to see how somebody would dial a telephone number and speak to somebody at the other end and go on speaking for 2 or 3 minutes and then wait for a response. Whereas in India, the habit was that you dialed a number, and of course you didn't get through, you dialed again and again, dialed as in the old rotary dial, and then you said, yeah, hello, you know, I'm so-and-so speaking, hello. You kept saying hello now and again. And then the reason became very clear that this, what those of you from the engineering side would know, is called a handshake protocol. That is, you make sure that you're connected. And the way of doing that was to keep repeating hello to make sure the other person is yet online and the line hasn't got cut or he or she hasn't disappeared. And so this hello, hello became a thing. It became a habit for people from my generation. And this struck me as how somehow the fact that the technology in the US was more reliable and taken for granted in those days created a different culture, how to influence their culture of how they spoke, versus what happened in India, where because of the uncertainty of technology, you had to keep repeating yourself. It's like speaking in parliament. If you've ever seen a parliamentary debate, they're of course done with emphasis to emphasize a certain point, but it always strikes me, I said, maybe these guys are all from my generation. No? They keep saying the same point again and again.
So, to come to the ethical questions that you alluded to earlier, you did say it's in the hands of men, and I think that is both the enabling, but that's also, in some ways, the terrifying aspect of technology, which is we often live with the illusion that technology is neutral, right? So driverless cars are a popular and often used example, that driverless cars are programmed to take certain decisions, and they will take them irrespective of the person at the other end. However, that is not true, because in recent crash tests, for example, and I'm not accusing cars of being racist, but the biases of the programmers, or the assumptions, if we're going to be more generous, the assumptions of programmers find their way into the technology. So there have been, for example, test cases where, because the test subjects were overwhelmingly white males, women or blacks were in fact run over more frequently or would have been hit more frequently in a crash test than white males. Now that's not an obvious programming instruction. It is, however, simply an assumption that if you've tested with a dozen white men, then you've covered all of humankind. My question there is, will technology not always carry the assumptions and biases of the programmers? In which case, is it ever possible to be truly neutral?
You know, I think you've given a very good example, and this is very striking because as you move towards more complex systems, as we move towards artificial intelligence, it begins with an algorithm which is programmed in, and then it begins to self-learn and so on. But the initial starting point, as you've said, is an algorithm which somebody has put in, and maybe completely unintentionally, maybe unknowingly, maybe even unconsciously, the biases of the person who programs do creep in. And this is, of course, a very striking example about the car, and there have been tests that have, as you rightly said, established that. But these unstated assumptions, these unconscious assumptions do come in. And therefore, for a country like us, it's very worrisome because at least in the next 5, maybe 10 years, hopefully only 5 years, we will get a lot of our things from technology imported from outside. And a lot of it will carry embedded software, which is built into the system. And that embedded software will come from a place like the US or the UK or Germany, typically from the Western world. And the biases there, the cultural dimensions there are very different and maybe completely contrary to what we in India would want to do. And there is therefore deep concern about these biases creeping in. And now there's enough evidence and research to show that, yes, there is really something there which we need to worry about. And then, of course, you have the more extreme example of whether the machines themselves are going to get, bias each other as they grow, because it's self-learning, and one machine, in a sense, teaches another. And so you might have a proliferation that comes from a single starting point.
So actually you preempted my next question, because one of the conversation around artificial intelligence or machine learning is always one of tremendous optimism. It suggests that machines will also constantly learn and refine themselves. What is the guarantee that machines will not constantly learn and refine the poor in human behavior rather than only the positive in human behavior?
No, I don't think, frankly, there's an easy guarantee on that. And therefore, one has to make sure that, in some sense, the human element of what is fed into these and where you control them and where you get feedback is kept very much in mind and on top. Otherwise, you will get this runaway effect and the extreme stories of machines taking over. That's a different part and can address that separately. But there is definitely a danger of their taking off in a way which is completely biased and maybe even different from what was even intended, because it suddenly brings in a different aspect as they learn and build their own methods of dealing with things.
The other area that tech almost invariably impacts, sometimes belatedly, is the law. Because a lot of pretty much all technological intervention that includes humankind invariably changes behavior. When you talk of, say, artificial intelligence, when you talk of the projected bionic being who may have a chip in his mind and who may have, well, we already have stents in our hearts. I don't know at what stage we stop calling ourselves human and start calling ourselves machine. But somebody who starts to answer to that description, how does the law deal with that? Are you still even dealing with a human being? You know, where are those, who is addressing those questions? And do we need a kind of consolidated, guiding planetary body to start asking, or rather to start legislating for this future that may be upon us sooner than we imagine?
You know, I think this is an absolute must. We've got some good examples starting many decades ago from the law of the oceans, which are all over. More recently, we have got global understanding with at least one major country backing out, but for climate change, where you have an understanding globally of what needs to be done, realizing that it affects all of us. And I think this is one area in which this is critically necessary because it's moving so very fast. And you give the example of bionic beings and how the law deals with them. There are complex issues that are coming up there about, you know, what is human and what is not, what is machine and what is not a machine, and you know, how is the law going to deal with this? And then you have much more complex issues of saying that identity. I mentioned Aadhaar very early on, but what's identity? I mean, who are you if all your body parts are replaced and even your brain is augmented or even replaced, then what is identity that's common? Is that person there at all? And I don't know whether you want to do it. I don't. You want to live forever or not, because this now becomes possible. And we'll all live forever. And then, as I told somebody, you might feel you're sitting in India International Center. But anyway, that's a different.
And just as a closing question, because that is where both technology can and one hopes can make a crucial intervention, is the whole area of climate change. We keep imagining that the destruction of the human species may come from things like nuclear weapons, but it seems far likelier. Every great extinction in the world has in fact come from the loss of natural habitat. While we're worried about other fears, do you think there is a very real possibility of human extinction through climate change? And do you think technology is in a position to pull us back from that disaster, or are we already too far gone?
I think there is a real danger first, and I don't think that we have taken it seriously enough, because beyond the point, as NP scientists tell you, you have the so-called runaway effect. If you cross that threshold, you just can't bring it back. And therefore, we need to take global action on it very, very quickly. And technology is certainly, there is a possibility of providing a big solution, because as you move away from more polluting technologies to less polluting ones, but also in terms of taking care of the pollution problems, things like carbon sequestration, where you can capture the carbon and store, make sure it doesn't go into the atmosphere. And at the very extreme, and I've just touched on this in my book too, maybe we have to migrate. And just as, you know, as I said, two ways of migration, just as the West again, and I don't want to slam them for things, but the West migrated all its polluting industries into, you know, Asia or Africa. Maybe we have to move all our polluting industries into space. So pollution is there, and this is a nice, clean dormitory suburb, which is good, no pollution, clean air. Or more distinct possibility is that maybe some of us have to migrate and set up a settlement outside, out somewhere in space or on a different planet. Who knows?
And to end on a lighter note, one final question. Selfies and technology. The act of having a mobile phone that can take seriously high quality pictures seems to have turned every one of us into a narcissist. Is that, I mean, I know you mentioned it in the book, so I ask, do you believe that human beings are now more narcissistic because of our relationship with technology? We are also, of course, having conversations with Alexa. So mostly you'll find Alexa is also programmed to answer questions like, how cool am I? And she will say, the coolest I've ever met, right? Are we programming technology to aid our inner narcissist?
Yes, I think so. I think this is, as you said, the narcissism is the mirror, mirror on the wall kind of story. And yes, we see a lot of that. But, I mean, you said end on a lighter note, but just a word of serious concern there. The selfies, as we read almost every day in the paper, have become a terrible thing. That chaps on railway tracks
250 people died because of taking
selfies. I mean, it's just become
in dangerous places.
Very, very bad. So I think there are concerns there. But yes, narcissism very much so. And to me, it's a change from the times when I was growing up, where it was a complete no-no to, and here you get all these people in very public places posing and preening and looking at this angle and this angle and this angle. It's amazing. But that's a new world altogether. So why not?
On that note, the new world with its possibilities and its particular downsides, the technology conversation can never finish. It can only start, because there are lots of areas. As we said, we didn't touch on the tech and law. We didn't touch on tech and, I would imagine, education and healthcare and what it can do. I would suggest you buy a copy of Mr. Karnik's book, because he systematically goes through each of these. I think what goes without saying is that it will require the intervention of every one of us consciously, not only to be shaped by technology, but to shape it ourselves in what we demand of it for a more equitable future. So thank you for starting that conversation with us, Mr. Karnik.
Thank you.
Thank you.